Hello and welcome to Freed Indeed Live. I'm your host, Kevin J. N. Hughes, the director of Freed Indeed Ministries. And I think today's might be a fairly quick one. But before we get into it too much, I want to give a special shout out to our sponsor, BibleMemory.com and the Bible Memory app. And right now, if you sign up for Bible Memory Pro and use promo code Freed Indeed, you'll get 30% off and you'll be supporting Freed Indeed Ministries, including keeping this show on the air. So definitely check out BibleMemory.com and especially the Bible Memory app. Most of us are already spending way too much time on our phones, so why not redeem that time by using it to memorize the words that God has inspired with the Bible Memory app? So thank you, BibleMemory.com and the Bible Memory app for sponsoring our show. With that said, today I want to talk about a quote from an Orthodox saint who said that a day was coming. Saint Anthony said that a day was coming when people would have to keep the Orthodox faith in an unorthodox world. And he was asked by his student whether people would be able to accomplish this, and he replied that it would be greater than even the greatest work of asceticism. And I have been meditating on that for a while now, because something that I find interesting about that quote is that a lot of Orthodox saints since that time and a lot of Orthodox Christians since that time have applied that quote to Orthodoxy after the fall of the Byzantine Empire, for one thing, but especially after the fall of Tsar Nicholas II, when we truly live in an unorthodox world. There is no Orthodox monarchy left. So even the Orthodox countries that remain are not, at least politically, they are not run by and large as Orthodox countries. Even Russia, as much as all of my based bros love to tout what Russia is doing, and Russia is doing very good things in this day and age. There's a lot of good news coming out of Russia. I just read an article that the Russian government is currently as we speak. They will have decided by the time this episode actually airs, but they are essentially labeling the LGBT alphabet movement to be an extremist organization. So all of that is to say there's a lot of good stuff coming out of Russia, but even Russia is not run in an orthodox way. Russia is a democracy, not a monarchy, and so their form of government is not biblical. And if you read Russia's constitution, it still lists itself as a secular state, just like the United States, where there's supposedly freedom of religion and separation of church and state. So even Russia is not, contrary to popular belief, technically an expressly confessionally Orthodox nation. I don't know for sure about Greece or like Bulgaria or those countries, but realistically, I think it's probably pretty safe to assume that just about anywhere you live, even if the population is mostly Orthodox, the at least the official stance of the government is going to be largely secular. So we live in a secular age, and the fathers and the saints say that keeping orthodoxy in a secular age is greater than any act of asceticism. And I've pondered why that is. And I think that I'm not going to claim to be able to explain exactly why it is, because truthfully, I don't know. And I don't even know for certain that our age is what they're talking about. Maybe things will get significantly worse than they already are as time goes on. Or maybe we are at the zenith of evil, and from this point forward, things will only progress in the right direction after this because, you know, maybe the world will realize that it can't get much more absurd than not knowing what boys and girls are, and people will swing the pendulum back in a more positive direction. I don't know the answer to these questions. What I do know is that the fact that so many of our holy saints have said this, it means that we should take note that keeping orthodoxy in an unorthodox world is something that is greater than any act of asceticism. We should take note of this statement. So I want to take a moment to ponder this statement with you guys. And I think that some reflections can come to light. So, one thing is, in a lot of ways, it was easier to keep orthodoxy in a world like, I don't know, 18th century Russia, where pretty much everyone was Orthodox. The state is run in an Orthodox way and is an Orthodox nation. It's pretty easy, right? I mean, obviously it's still difficult. You know, you have the fasts, but most people around you are doing the fasts with you. Most people around you are keeping Lent, so it's much less difficult to keep Lent because you're not having to do it alone. Like we here in America, when we keep Lent, you know, if I want to go out to eat with my wife, it's more difficult because everybody around me isn't fasting, and it's not like the restaurant pulls out their Lent friendly menu during this time of year. So I'm having to figure out, you know, how to avoid compromising. And in some folks' case, maybe you're not the one who prepares your own food. Maybe you live with family or live in a retirement village or something, and someone else is preparing your meals for you. It can be very difficult to, because on the one hand, you don't want to offend them and you don't want to turn away the food, but on the other hand, you are trying to avoid compromising on the fast. And these are just, you know, this is just a very small example of a broader issue that I think it's talking about. So it's much simpler, I should say. Excuse me. If you live in a village where your whole community is Orthodox, it's very simple to keep Orthodoxy. You don't have any fear that you're going to go to the local library and they're going to be having drag queen story hour, because that simply isn't something that would happen in your community if everybody is Orthodox. Instead, if you go to the local library and they're having an event, it's a Bible story hour or something to that effect. You don't have to worry that the local public school is going to have creepy groomer teachers trying to convince your kids that they're gay communists. Because again, in a community where everybody is Orthodox, you don't even have that concern. You're probably homeschooling your kids anyway in that sort of community. But if you're not, then there's nobody to be trying to indoctrinate our kids with these bizarre ideas if everybody around you is Orthodox. But that's not the world that most of us live in. Most of us are trying to keep the Orthodox faith in a world that seems totally hostile to Orthodoxy, and not just in the overt kind of hostility that I'm talking about, but even in subtle ways. For example, most people's jobs are not so understanding of their time that they're going to let you keep all of the Orthodox divine liturgy. They're not going to let you have the day off every single time there's a liturgical event happening at church so that you can participate in it. And that's going to make it difficult. Some jobs are increasingly wanting you to work even on Sundays. And it's become very difficult in the 21st century for us as Christians to even get jobs where we can even get Sundays off, because the expectation is that you'll work on Sundays. I remember I was so grateful when Cheryl and I lived in Colton. I was able to get a job at the Asics shoe store, and they didn't require me to work on Sundays. So the manager who hired me accepted my Sunday clause that I was only going to be hired if they didn't force me to work on Sundays. And she said, fine. And she hired me. Well, that was all well and good, except that I think it was like 8 months later. Cheryl can correct me if I'm wrong, because I know that I don't keep track of time very well, but I think it was about 8 months later. That manager ended up leaving the company and moving on to other endeavors, and was replaced by another manager who told me that I needed to start working on Sundays. And I said no. When I started this job, I started with the understanding that I wouldn't be working on Sundays. And she said, well, I wouldn't have hired you then. And I said, that's fine, but you are under contract. And so, because I had made it clear, and so what she ended up doing was she started cutting my hours so that I was getting a lot less time. Now, I had been the number one salesman at the shoe store for almost the entire time I had been working there. I had been either one of their top salesmen or their top salesman. And then she started cutting my hours. And because I wasn't getting very many hours, my sales numbers plummeted because I wasn't there. So I'm not there. So obviously I'm not getting as many sales, but as a result, my numbers were really low. And I came to her and I said, I need more hours. And she said, well, are you willing to start working on Sundays? And I said, no. And she said, well, then I'm sorry, but all of our hours are full. So you can see, I mean, obviously that's probably an extreme example. I don't think most companies are treating their employees quite on that level. But I do think this is an example of something that all Christians face in the workforce today, but especially us as Orthodox Christians, because for us, Orthodoxy isn't something that I only do on Sunday. Orthodoxy is something that I'm expected to live out every day of the week. But now that we no longer, Aaron and I were talking about the fact that the world used to operate on an agrarian economy. And because of that, people in feudal Europe only had to work 150 days a year. And the rest of the year, the church ensured that there were all these holy days that people could be in church and that people were doing church activities and that people were in community. And imagine how much easier it is to keep the faith when the world around you operates on an agrarian kind of calendar, so that you are not expected to work on days that you're supposed to be in church. But that's not the way that's certainly not the way that it is in America. Maybe in like rural Russian living, they still live on a largely agrarian calendar and have this wonderful traditional way of life. And I know that in a lot of Latin American countries, one of the things that I so admire about the Latin American culture is that they have this meant like when Cheryl and I were in Costa Rica, their whole mentality is what they call pura vida. They always say pura vida. So if you show up late for work and you walk in and you're like, I'm sorry, boss, I'm late for work. He says, oh, tranquila, pura vida. You know, you were eating breakfast with your Tio. You know, that I wouldn't intrude on that. They just have a completely different mentality. And so if you live in Costa Rica, I think it'd be so much easier to be Orthodox because the community around you doesn't expect you to put your job ahead of your family and your soul. Whereas in America, people have this expectation that your job should be everything to you and should be this idol upon which you're willing to sacrifice your very soul, let alone your family. And so, because of that, you know, it is difficult to keep the faith because you have all of these sort of externals trying to push against you in keeping the faith. Whether it's capitalism trying to punish you for keeping the faith, but also B, in a more subtle sense, offering you rewards and enticements to move away from the faith. You know, oh, it'll be so much easier. Oh, you can make so much more money. Oh, you can advance. Oh, you can get more hours. Oh, you can do all this stuff. It offers you all of these little enticements to try, oh, just sacrifice a little bit of your family and you can provide a better life for them. Oh, just sacrifice a little bit of your time that you could be spending at church. And don't worry, someday when you retire, you'll be able to do all those things that you want to do. Ignore the fact that you probably never will retire if you're a millennial or Gen Z. Um, but you know, when you retire, you can do all those spiritual things you want to do. Until then, work yourself to the bone and die for a corporate entity. Um, but will reward you. Will reward you with these with money and promotions and all these things. So you see, it's not just this aggressive sort of cranking of the mill upon us, but you also have these enticements. And so it is difficult for that reason. So then the question becomes, and those are just like one aspect. There's other aspects too. For example, the prawn, the ease of access to the prawn. How many young men have succumbed to the prawn who in former generations never would have even known such a thing existed? Um, in the 1920s, you know, a young man might maybe get to see, you know, a naked woman a couple times in his adolescent life, like a photograph of a woman in her underwear or something a couple times in his adolescent life. Now, a simple internet search, you can find thousands upon thousands, an entire library, all like almost a library of Babylon, of images of naked women. And it's not good for a young man's soul to be so inundated and perverted by these images and by these videos, and by these just ease of access to the fulfillment of the passions in this way. It does not breed self-control, it does not breed self-discipline, and it does not breed in him a sense, it does not cultivate in him a sense of desire and love for the opposite sex, but rather it cultivates in him a sense of just lust and um and yes, desire in one sense, but it's a perverted desire. So it's not a desire for marriage and the family and building a life together. It's a desire to take and possess and have. And that is destructive not only to society, but it's destructive to the very soul of the individual. And then you have, in addition to that, you have feminist programming in movies and television, such that, um, it's like Cheryl and I used to love to go see superhero movies and things, but in this day and age, there's no real enjoyment because superhero movies are nothing more than propaganda, truly satanic propaganda against the Christian faith and against Christian morality. Same with so many other forms of media. That's just one example. But look at every sitcom that has come out in the last 30 plus years. You have example after example of sitcoms where the father is a bumbling idiot, the mother is holding his balls on a chain running the house, and there's just all of it's just constant cultural programming to inundate us with the message of feminism and just antichrist messaging constantly, such that I'm going to be honest, I can't even really enjoy hardly any sitcoms. There've been a few shows and movies that I've enjoyed over the last few years, The Office, Parks and Recreation, but even in those, there is a sense in which there is some of that programming, like in the relationship between Jim and Pam. Jim sacrifices all this so that Pam can pursue her dreams, and her dreams are not to be a wife and mother. No, no, her dreams are to have this career in art. And he sacrifices all this, and then ultimately she just decides that they're growing apart, and there's this whole drama about it. And then in the end, she kind of redeems herself a little bit by making it so that he can pursue his dream in this sports thing. But at first, she torpedoes that and destroys it and makes it so that he can't pursue it. And then eventually she relents. But the point is that there's this double standard where if a man is pursuing his ambitions and things, then he's, oh, he doesn't care about me anymore, and he doesn't want, he doesn't love me anymore. But if a woman wants to pursue her career and ambitions, even to the destruction of her relationship with her family, then this is to be lionized and idolized. And all of these things are mere reflections of what our cultural overlords want us to be imbibing, the so-called virtues that they want to be instilling in us. And over again, these sitcoms, if they aren't preaching this feminist narrative, then they are instead preaching this loose living, like the Community or the Big Bang show, where Christianity is seen as this idiotic, backwards ideology, and these people just live these loose lives of constantly searching out sexually transmitted diseases. And this is the life that our televisions are promoting. Now, Cheryl and I don't even have a television anymore. I haven't watched sitcoms in many, many years, and um, but I get, I get a general sense of what a lot of them are about just from seeing clips and from folks I know who still watch television telling me about them, and I find them so appalling. I don't understand how anybody can find this stuff funny. But it's not really about being funny. It's really about promoting a cultural narrative. And this is why um, countries like Russia are fighting back against this cultural narrative, because they're recognizing how destructive it is, and they're recognizing how anti-Christian it is. And that is the narrative that dominates American culture. And so why does this matter? Because again, this just makes it all the more difficult to, like, if you lived in Russia in the 17th century, then you can still participate in the culture around you. You can still go to the ballet with your friends. You can still, go out to the public house and have a couple drinks and talk about the things that are going on. And you can do all of that in a Christian way. You can do all of that without compromising any of your Christian values. But today, if I just want to go see a movie, then I have to ask myself whether this movie is going to be charged with a bunch of feminist programming and antichrist programming, or if it's going to be just a normal movie that I can enjoy with my family. It's more difficult to raise our kids to be Orthodox because you're constantly trying to shield them from a world of influences that are trying to destroy the faith from their young minds. Um, on the other hand, you're also not wanting to shield them so much that when they do get exposed to these things, they are ill prepared for it. You want to shield them from the influence of it, but simultaneously, you're trying to answer these objections as they're growing up so that when they're older, they're ready for it. And all of this is to say that in former times, it wasn't always this way. But we live in a time and place in which it is difficult and inconvenient to be a Christian. And I think that that is, whether intentionally or not, it's engineered by the society around us. And that's why the saints talk about this being greater than the greatest act of asceticism, just to keep the faith in this kind of society, because everything external is trying to pull you away. And you have to be able to fight back and hold firm and be driven by the one all-consuming desire for Christ. And if you can't do that, you will fall away, because the cares of this world will choke you out. The demons will pluck the seed from the ground, and there is just an innumerable host of enemies trying to, both seen and unseen, trying their level best to wipe out the Christian faith from you. And so, but it's not hopeless, because the saints also say that there will be those who overcome even in this time. And even our Lord Jesus Christ said that in the end of days it would be this way. And yet, and he says, if those times were not shortened for the sake of the elect, then even the elect themselves would be swept away by the tide of evil. But he says that God will shorten those days. So we look forward to the parousia of Christ, and we know that no matter what happens, no matter how bad society gets, no matter how evil the world around us is, if we keep fighting, if we keep pressing, we can overcome, because Jesus Christ has overcome the world. So thank you very much for watching. Please share this with your friends so that they too can be freed indeed. God bless.